Genesis places four expressions close together: the sons of God, the Nephilim, the mighty men, and the men of renown. Are these names for one group, stages in one family line, or distinct labels whose closeness has encouraged readers to connect what the passage leaves separate? Genesis chapter 6 names the Nephilim but does not define them. Around that name, it describes marriages, children, famous warriors, human violence, divine grief, and Noah finding favor. The scene is crowded, while its explanation is remarkably compressed. That compression has invited answers, from heavenly rebellion to human dynasties. But age does not turn interpretation into an explicit sentence in Genesis, and an impressive image is not archaeological proof. To ask who the Nephilim were, we must first ask what the earliest texts actually say. The World English Bible is our approved public domain English reference, not another ancient manuscript. Its Genesis chapter 6 wording says, God's sons. When this episode says sons of God elsewhere, it is using the conventional English expression, or the controlled Greek rendering, not silently quoting the WEB. The scene opens as humankind multiplies, and the sons choose women as wives before the narrative moves toward a divine limit on human life. Then comes the sentence that carries most of the mystery. In explicit paraphrase, the WEB places the Nephilim on earth in those days and afterward, says God's sons had children with men's daughters, and then describes mighty men of old, men of renown. The clauses stand beside one another, but the verse does not stop to draw a family diagram. Does the WEB phrase, had children with them, identify those children as the Nephilim? Does it identify them as the mighty men? Does those were the mighty men who were of old point backward to the children, the Nephilim, or an overlapping remembered class of figures? English punctuation can make one arrangement feel obvious, but punctuation is already an editorial aid. The underlying relationships still have to be argued. The next movement of the story is much less ambiguous. Genesis says human wickedness was great, that the inclination of human thought was continually evil, and that the earth faced judgment. The chapter's moral camera turns toward humanity as a whole. It ends this short unit by introducing Noah, who finds favor. Whatever the mysterious figures contribute, the narrative does not let them absorb the entire cause of corruption. This matters because a retelling can quietly change the center of gravity. If every line is made to serve a hidden biography of supernatural giants, the plainly stated emphasis on human violence and divine grief fades into the background. If every unusual expression is flattened into an ordinary genealogy, the strangeness of the wording disappears. A careful reading has to preserve both the mystery and the chapter's stated moral movement. The difficulty predates internet culture. Jewish and Christian interpreters have proposed different readings for centuries, while academic work compares the Hebrew, Greek translation, Second Temple literature, and ancient Near Eastern parallels. The long disagreement shows genuine difficulty, not equal support for every proposal. What can be established before choosing a theory? We can trace the narrative, compare the Hebrew labels, examine early Greek translation, and distinguish Genesis from later stories. Throughout, one boundary remains. Textual evidence can show what people wrote and believed without proving that a recovered body belonged to the Nephilim. The Masoretic textual tradition preserves the phrase B'nai ha-Elohim, commonly translated sons of God, in Genesis chapter 6, verse 2, and again in verse 4. In the same verse, it separately uses Hanaphalim, the Nephilim, Hagibarim, the mighty men, and Anshe, Hashem, men of the name, conventionally rendered men of renown. At the level of vocabulary, these are distinct expressions. Distinct expressions do not require four completely separate populations. A person can be described by a family relationship, a social role, and a reputation. Yet distinct expressions also cannot simply be collapsed without explanation. If someone says the Nephilim, the children, the mighty men, and the renowned men are exactly the same group, that is a proposed reading of the syntax, not a translation of one repeated noun. Begin with sons of God. Who would an ancient audience hear in that phrase? One major reading understands it as heavenly or divine beings. That possibility is not created by later fantasy. Biblical language elsewhere can use divine family or heavenly court imagery. Within Genesis chapter 6, the contrast between sons of God and daughters of humankind can sound like a boundary between heavenly and human categories. But that observation has limits. The phrase can support a celestial reading without supplying the complete Watcher narrative known from later literature. Genesis does not use the word watchers here. It does not describe a descent from a named mountain, list angelic leaders, teach forbidden arts, or narrate a war against giant offspring. Those belong to fuller reception traditions, not to the explicit wording of these verses. The next label is the Nephilim. The Hebrew appears with the definite article in Genesis chapter 6, verse 4, Nephilim the Nephilim. The familiar English pronunciation is Nephilim, while a teaching pronunciation of the Hebrew form sounds closer to Ha-Nephilim. The form is important to preserve accurately. Its sound, however, does not solve its identity. The controlled Hebrew witness preserves the name, but does not define it or supply an etymology in Genesis chapter 6. Proposed derivations, therefore, cannot settle the Nephilim's identity within this source base. The responsible starting point is the attested form and its place in the verse, not a biography built from an unsupported word origin. Genesis then uses the distinct Hebrew form Hagiborim. In explicit paraphrase, the following WEB clause describes mighty men who were known from old and were men of renown. The controlled sources establish the separate form and its rendering here. They do not by themselves establish a complete semantic range or decide whether this label overlaps with the Nephilim. The WEB's expression men of renown adds a reputation label, not a second physical description. That label might overlap with the children, the mighty men, or the Nephilim, but reputation cannot prove parentage. The verse leaves the edges of its categories indistinct. Some translations and retellings make the equation direct. The children of the unions were the giants, who were the mighty men of old. That is grammatically possible as an interpretive synthesis. It also resolves several questions at once. But the Hebrew verse is not a modern definition list. Its clauses can be related in more than one way, and the Nephilim are said to be present in those days before the union is restated. What does the WEB's timing phrase, and also after that, mean? It may extend the presence of the Nephilim beyond the immediate moment described. It may anticipate the later use of their name in Numbers. It may simply mark a remembered period before and after the unions. The phrase is brief enough to generate several timelines, and none explains by itself how a pre-flood name appears in a post-flood scout report. This is where some modern systems add a survival mechanism, an unstated continuity path, a second angelic incursion, or descendants preserved through the flood. The controlled source corpus does not supply one. Genesis chapter 6 does not explain a mechanism, and Numbers 13 does not pause to harmonize itself with the flood narrative. The continuity question is real, but the answer remains outside what these passages directly state. The wording also permits overlap without total identity. The Nephilim could be a known group present during the episode. The children of the unions could become mighty figures, and some or all could be remembered as renowned. Or the labels could point to the same figures from different angles. The evidence lets interpreters build models. It does not label one model as the uncontested grammar of the verse. Why, then, preserve the distinction so carefully? Because the passage itself changes scale. It begins with population growth, narrows to selective taking of women, names unusual groups, then broadens again to the corruption of human thought. Each label participates in that movement. When we make every noun interchangeable, we risk replacing the literary shape of Genesis with a cleaner story of our own making. The act of taking wives has also drawn attention. In explicit paraphrase, the narrative describes God's sons choosing women and taking them as wives. That can sound forceful or elite, especially in a reading focused on power. At minimum, the emphasis lies on their choice. The women's lineage and consent are not explained in this compressed scene. That detail can fit more than one interpretation. Heavenly beings crossing a boundary, a privileged human lineage abandoning restraint, or rulers exercising unchecked power can all use the act of taking as evidence. The narrative pattern matters, but it does not function like a name tag. One action can be coherent within several models, especially when the passage withholds the identities each model wants to specify. At this stage, the most stable conclusion is modest. The Hebrew gives us 4 distinct expressions. It links them within one dense scene. It does not define the Nephilim by height, appearance, or material culture. And it does not explicitly say, in a single unambiguous clause, the Nephilim were the children of the sons of God and the women. That sentence is an interpretation, even when it is an ancient and plausible one. The name appears again in Numbers 13, in a very different setting. Israelite scouts have surveyed Canaan. On returning, they describe fruitful land and formidable inhabitants. Most of the scouts warn that the people are stronger than Israel. Their report grows darker as they speak, until they associate the people they saw with the Nephilim and identify them with descendants of Anak. The narrative frames this as the scouts' report. They say that they seemed like grasshoppers in their own sight, and so they seemed in the inhabitants' sight. That is vivid fear language and self-comparison. It tells us how overwhelmed the scouts felt and how they represented the encounter to the community. It does not record a measured height, a census category, or an independent observer's anatomical description. Does Numbers confirm that the same beings from before the flood survived in Canaan? It confirms that the name Nephilim was used in the scouts, terrifying account and linked there with Anakite ancestry. It does not explain how that connection works across the flood story. The report may invoke a remembered category of terrifying figures. It may make a literal ancestry claim. The text preserves the claim without resolving its mechanism. This does not mean the scouts saw nothing intimidating. The narrative consistently presents fortified cities and powerful populations as real challenges. The point is narrower. A simile about grasshoppers cannot responsibly be converted into an exact number of feet or cubits. When later retellings offer precise giant heights, they have moved beyond what Numbers 13 supplies. A second line of evidence comes from the ancient Greek translation commonly called the Septuagint. The controlled critical line represented by nits, based on the Göttingen edition, renders the phrase in Genesis chapter 6 verse 2 and 6-4 as sons of God. For the Nephilim it uses the Greek gigantes, which nets renders giants. Those two translation choices need to be kept distinct. Nets renders gigantes as giants. That translation choice records how the critical Greek line represents the Hebrew name, but neither the Greek term on the page nor its English rendering supplies a measured height, a discovered body, or a precise physiology. Those conclusions would require evidence beyond this translation witness. What about popular summaries that make the Greek wording uniformly angelic? That is too broad. An angels of God wording is reported in part of the Greek manuscript and reception stream, often discussed in connection with particular witnesses. But the controlled nets and Göttingen line reads, sons of God. The variant is real enough to discuss and limited enough that it must not be universalized. A complete map of which Greek witness reads which form would require apparatus-level verification in the critical edition. The accessible sources used for this episode establish the boundary, not every siglum, so the responsible formulation is exact. Some Greek witnesses are reported to preserve an angels of God variant, while the controlled critical wording has sons of God. Anything stronger would pretend to a manuscript census we have not performed. This textual detail teaches a larger lesson. Ancient reception did not begin only after the biblical period, and translation itself can preserve interpretation. A scribe or textual community that transmitted angels of God made the heavenly reading more explicit. A critical text that reads sons of God leaves the underlying phrase intact. Both data points matter, but they answer different questions. The Israel Antiquities Authority's Dead Sea Scrolls Archive classifies surviving fragment 4Q531 under the catalog name, quote, 4Q Enoch, Book of Giants. That classification is concrete archive evidence for the fragment record. It is a modern catalog label, not a claim that the complete title is visibly written on the surviving fragment. What does the catalog record establish? At this evidentiary level, only that the IAA preserves and classifies a surviving fragment as 4Q Enoch, Book of Giants. The page is not a complete edition or translation, and it does not prove that giant beings existed, that Genesis contained a later plot, or that archaeologists recovered such a body. The artifact is physical manuscript evidence, not physical evidence for the beings in the story. Academic study of Enochic and Watcher traditions treats them as later, much fuller reception of the terse Genesis episode. Their value here is historical. They show an early celestial direction in interpretation. Their additional narrative detail must remain attributed to those later traditions, rather than presented as hidden lines of Genesis. Josephus gives another ancient reception witness. Writing in the Roman period, he retells the pre-flood story in his Antiquities. His account describes sons confident in their strength, whose deeds he compares with those whom Greeks called giants. This is evidence for a later angelic and giant comparison reading, not a statement of measured physical size. Josephus is not an eyewitness to the primeval world, and his narrative is not an excavation report. He writes long after the period his story describes. Even the English edition commonly consulted includes editorial framing that must not be confused with Josephus' own words. His value here is historical. He helps us trace what some ancient readers believed Genesis meant. Put these witnesses on a timeline, and the categories become clearer. Genesis preserves the compressed scene. An ancient Greek translation shows how key labels were rendered, and how a variant could sharpen one reading. Second Temple writings expand the heavenly and giant traditions. Josephus preserves another later retelling. This is a substantial reception history, but it is not a stack of independent eyewitness reports. Could a manuscript fragment, an ancient book, or an image of a Near Eastern heroic figure still count as archaeology? They can be archaeological artifacts in the ordinary sense of objects recovered and cataloged. What they cannot do without an explicit evidentiary link is identify a Nephilim body or portrait. An ancient object can prove that an image, text, or tradition existed. It does not automatically prove the depicted being existed. No controlled excavation dataset in this episode's approved corpus establishes a Nephilim skeleton, body, weapon, city, or biological lineage. Viral photographs of oversized bones do not become reliable because they are placed beside Hebrew text. Contextual cylinder seals, protective figures, or heroic imagery may illuminate the visual and religious environment of the ancient Near East, but they must not be captioned as pictures of the Nephilim. By the end of this evidence tour, several facts stand. Numbers preserves the Nephilim name in a Frightened Scout report. The critical Greek tradition uses sons of God and giants, while a reported variant stream makes the angelic identification explicit. A Second Temple Book of Giants manuscript is cataloged, and Josephus tells an angelic retelling. Each witness adds information, but none erases the distinctions among text, translation, reception, and material proof. With those distinctions in place, which interpretation best accounts for Genesis chapter 6? 3 readings have remained especially important: the celestial or watcher reading, the Sethite reading, and the ruler or elite reading. Each notices something real in the passage. Each also has to infer something the passage does not directly say. A fair comparison should make every case as strongly as its evidence allows before naming its cost. The celestial reading begins with the phrase, sons of God. It hears that phrase as a reference to heavenly beings, and reads the contrast with daughters of humankind as a crossing between divine and human spheres. The unusual children and renowned mighty figures then belong naturally in a story of a forbidden boundary. Ancient Greek variation, Enochic literature, the Book of Giants tradition, and Josephus show that this reading has deep reception historical roots. Its strongest advantage is explanatory reach. It accounts for why the story sounds unlike an ordinary marriage notice. It gives the celestial human contrast full weight. It also explains why ancient readers could develop the episode into a watcher and giant tradition. The interpretation does not need to invent that ancient reception. It needs only to distinguish the compact source from the larger narrative later communities built around it. Its material objection is the same distinction. Genesis itself does not call the beings angels, does not call them fallen, does not name watchers, and does not explicitly identify the Nephilim as their children. To move from sons of God to the complete later story requires several steps. Those steps may be coherent and ancient, but they are still interpretive. The reading is strongest when it does not claim that Genesis says more than it does. The Sethite reading asks whether the entire episode can remain within the human family. On this view, the sons of God are descendants of Seth, understood as a faithful line, while the daughters of humankind come from another human line, often associated with Cain. The marriages represent the collapse of a moral or covenant boundary, and the ensuing corruption prepares the way for the flood. Its strongest case comes from narrative continuity. Genesis has just traced family lines, and the larger story is increasingly concerned with human sin. A human lineage interpretation keeps responsibility on humanity and makes the mixed marriages part of the movement toward pervasive wickedness. It also avoids having to explain how non-human beings marry and produce children. The main objection is textual absence. Genesis chapter 6 does not name Seth, Cain, a godly lineage, or an ungodly lineage. Daughters of humankind sounds broad, not like a technical title for one family. And if sons of God naturally suggested Sethites, the strong heavenly reading in ancient reception becomes harder to explain. The Sethite model can fit the surrounding genealogy, but the key identifications must be brought into the passage. The ruler or elite reading focuses on power. In the ancient world, kings and elites could claim divine status, divine descent, or special relationship with the gods. Genesis says the sons of God saw women and took any they chose. On this reading, the scene condemns rulers, judges, or warrior elites who turned privilege into possession and built reputations through domination. Its strongest case is ethical and social within the ancient setting. In explicit paraphrase, the WEB describes God's sons taking as wives any women they wanted. That can sound like unchecked authority. Mighty men and men of renown fit the world of heroic dynasties. The passage's swift turn toward violence and judgment then exposes celebrated power as part of human corruption, not as evidence that fame equals divine approval. Its material objection is lexical. Sons of God is not simply the ordinary Hebrew word for kings, judges, or nobles in this verse. Ancient Near Eastern comparisons can show that rulers use divine language, but an analogy is not a direct translation. The plural phrase and the ancient celestial reception still require explanation. The ruler reading is narratively illuminating, but it cannot present its social insight as a dictionary definition. Comparing the three reveals why the debate persists. The celestial reading explains the otherness of the phrase and the earliest expansive reception. The Sethite reading integrates the genealogies and centers human unfaithfulness. The ruler reading connects selective taking, might, fame, and abuse of power. Each captures part of the passage's texture. None arrives without an inference at the point where Genesis is most compressed. The relationship among the Nephilim children, mighty men, and renowned men remains a test for all three. The celestial reading often treats them as supernatural offspring or overlapping giant heroes. The Sethite reading may treat them as violent human descendants or as already present figures. The ruler reading may see them as warrior elites or legendary champions. The verse does not annotate which model its label should follow. This is why the history of interpretation is more useful as a map than as a vote. A long-lived reading deserves attention because it shows what generations found plausible. A minority reading may notice a neglected feature. Neither popularity nor novelty settles the grammar. The task is to compare how much each view explains, how early its support appears, and how many unstated connections it requires. None of the three readings receives a shortcut from archaeology. No approved artifact bears a controlled inscription saying it depicts the Nephilim of Genesis chapter 6. No body comes with a reliable chain of excavation, dating, textual identification, and peer-reviewed analysis connecting it to these verses. The interpretations rise or fall primarily on textual, literary, linguistic, and reception historical arguments. If we rank conclusions by confidence, what belongs on the firmest level? First, the Hebrew text uses distinct labels. Second, Genesis places them in a dense sequence without fully diagramming their relationship. Third, the controlled critical Greek wording says sons of God and uses gigantes for the Nephilim. These are observations about surviving textual witnesses, not conclusions about anatomy. We can also say that Genesis is interested in more than identity. Its movement runs from human multiplication to selective taking, from unusual figures to pervasive wickedness, from divine grief to judgment, and finally to Noah's favor. A theory that explains the Nephilim but ignores that movement has not yet explained the passage as a whole. The mystery sits inside a moral narrative rather than replacing it. Numbers 13 adds a second biblical use of the name. It links Nephilim with descendants of Anak inside the Scouts, report and preserves their grasshopper comparison. The safest historical claim is about the report itself. The name functioned as a language of terrifying human opposition. Whether the Scouts intended literal ancestry, rhetorical intensification, or both cannot be converted into an exact physical measurement. The Greek evidence supports another bounded conclusion. Translators represented the Nephilim with gigantes. The controlled critical line retains sons of God, while an angels of God wording is reported in part of the witness stream. This makes the celestial interpretation visible within ancient textual reception. It does not justify saying every Septuagint manuscript identifies the beings as angels, and it supplies no numerical height. These witnesses contribute different kinds of reception evidence. The IAA catalog establishes the surviving 4Q531 fragment classification. Josephus preserves a later strength and deeds comparison with those Greeks called giants. Academic study places fuller Enochic and Watcher narratives in the history of interpretation. Their later detail must remain attributed rather than presented as disguised lines of Genesis. On the next level, sit the major identities. A heavenly meaning for sons of God is a substantial reading with early support. A Sethite meaning provides a human genealogical account, but depends on lineages the passage does not name. A ruler or elite meaning offers a powerful account of coercion and fame, but relies on contested analogy. The evidence can compare these readings more confidently than it can pronounce one uncontested winner. What remains unknown? The exact referent of Nephilim in Genesis chapter 6, the precise overlap among the four labels, any numerical height, and any mechanism connecting the pre-flood name with Numbers 13. The text does not tell us whether and also after that, anticipates the later report, describes the same era more broadly, or points to a tradition whose intermediate explanation has not survived. Unknown does not mean meaningless, and it does not make every speculation equally possible. It means the controlled witnesses do not answer the question. Unsupported identities and mechanisms remain unsupported, however complete their stories sound. Mystery is not a blank check. The responsible boundary is narrower than certainty and much narrower than sensational invention. The archaeological boundary is equally clear. We have manuscript artifacts that document the transmission of ideas. We may have ancient Near Eastern objects that provide broad cultural context. What we do not have in the approved evidence is an excavated Nephilim body, a verified portrait, or a named artifact demonstrably tied to Genesis chapter 6. Textual claims and material claims require different chains of evidence. Why insist on this distinction in a story about ancient mystery? Because the most interesting evidence is strong enough without exaggeration. A scroll fragment can carry us into the imagination of a Second Temple community. A Greek variant can show an interpretation entering textual transmission. Josephus can reveal an ancient retelling. None becomes less fascinating when we describe honestly what kind of evidence it is. The result is not indecision for its own sake. It is a layered judgment. Some claims are directly witnessed, some are strong interpretations, some remain materially disputed, some are unknown within the bounded corpus. Keeping those levels visible allows faith-aware reading and historical analysis to share the same table, without either pretending the evidence has no limits. So, who were the Nephilim? Genesis names them in the troubled world before the flood, near the sons of God, human women, children, mighty men, and men of renown. It then turns toward human wickedness, judgment, and Noah's favor. Those statements belong to the text. The celestial reading has deep early reception, but Genesis does not supply its complete watcher story. The Sethite and ruler readings offer coherent human explanations, but each imports unstated identities. The relationship among the labels remains disputed, not solved by a confident family tree. Surviving manuscripts and ancient retellings document belief, interpretation, translation, and expansion. They do not provide archaeological proof of a Nephilim body or portrait. The evidence becomes clearer when kept within its textual and reception historical limits. The earliest recoverable texts supply no uncontested identity, exact height, continuity route across the flood, or physical proof. They preserve a compact mystery surrounded by ancient attempts to understand it. The text supports serious readings while withholding the certainty that spectacle promises. Perhaps the lasting question is not only which label fits the Nephilim, it is whether we can let an ancient text remain precise where it speaks and restrained where it is silent. Genesis chapter 6 gives us names, actions, consequences, and a warning about human corruption. What it does not give us is permission to turn uncertainty into proof.